Hey everyone, it is Wednesday of week 1 of the Summer Paintings Project. We're on painting number 3 today. I'm gonna bend the rules just a little bit for the painting today and allow my wife to make an appearance in the painting, kind of. It's mostly focused on my daughter, Cecily. So again, if you're enjoying the content of these videos and you wanna support this project, please consider clicking the link in the description where you'll be able to head on over to my website and you'll see these paintings for sale. All right, so let's get painting. Okay, so again, this week we are focusing on paintings made from iPhone photos of my 2 girls. I have 2 daughters. One is named Agnes, the other one is named Cecily. Today's painting is the debut painting of Cecily. We haven't done a painting of her yet, so this is pretty exciting. This one, I said that I was bending the rules a little bit, mostly just because Katie is in this painting a little bit too. This is a photo that I took back in January, sometime in mid-January before everything got crazy. And it's an image of Katie nursing Cecily. So yesterday's painting really, I think what made that painting was the focus on the cropping and how that controlled the narrative. And today, I really wanted to sort of continue that theme. So this actually isn't the original cropping of this iPhone photo. I cropped in a lot more tightly than the original so that I could steer the composition in a different direction. So as you see how I'm building this composition out through the drawing process, you'll notice that I have Cecily's head down in the lower half of this composition. It's a vertical composition or a portrait orientation. Her head is in the lower half of the composition, and then the upper half of the composition is totally consumed by Katie and Katie's hand and Katie's breasts. So the composition is divided up in this way, but it's also divided up into these sort of strong blocks of shape of different almost bands or different shapes. The bottom of the painting, as we get further into it, you'll see that the bottom of the painting or the bottom of the composition has these really deep, rich, dark blocks. And then the top has these really deep, rich, dark blocks as well. So it's sort of bracketed top and bottom. And then the center of the composition is this moment of connection or this moment of intimacy that Cecily and Katie share just through nursing. So as I was doing just a little bit of research for today's painting, and I was thinking about like, where does nursing fit into art history and the history of painting? And as soon as I started just Google searching a little bit, it was kind of fascinating how much there is on the internet about this right now. There's like an amazing amount of Instagram accounts completely devoted just to artwork throughout history of nursing mothers. And a lot of these accounts are just fascinating. They're really beautiful and really empowering too. And it was just so fascinating to see how much work there was within this genre of nursing. One of the most obvious is the Virgin Mary and Child, the Virgin and Child. It's an actual motif. There's just so much Christian art that centers on the Virgin and Child that you almost have to classify them into different types of Virgin and Child pictures. Some of them are just so tender, you could say. There's so much affection and love in the paintings. One of those that really stuck out to me was Leonardo da Vinci's Madonna and Child. You just see this sort of gaze of the Virgin Mary looking down at Jesus in that painting, and it has this almost just adoration and love in the gaze. And then the child's looking out at the viewer and clearly is in a state of just comfort and safety and peace. And I think that painting perfectly illustrates that. There are some other motifs, though, that take a different route. One of them, I would say, is Virgin and Child Surrounded by Angels by Jean Fouquet. This piece, it shows the Virgin looking down at the Christ child with her breast exposed in this very sort of regal, very royal looking pose. She's so poised and confident and solid. Her whole psychology is just that of peace and magnificence, even. This sort of just dominates the painting, her presence. But then you have a really interesting element too. The Christ child in that painting isn't breastfeeding. He's almost uninterested in breastfeeding. I mean, we could interpret this a few ways. Maybe he just finished breastfeeding and he is now just sitting there poised and content, having been fed. I suppose there are other ways to interpret that as well. Maybe it was the artist's way of showing the majesty of the Christ child and sort of the godliness of this Christ child in this image. So pretty fascinating. And you get some other pieces like Roger van der Weyden's painting, St. Luke painting the Virgin, that is totally different. It's just so charming, I guess, is the best way to put it. The baby Jesus in this painting just looks so happy to be nursing. He's got this smile on his face. And the Virgin just looks almost amused and serene to be able to feed her child in this way. And then you have St. Luke just sitting there painting them. And there's nothing weird about it to him. I mean, apparently there was nothing weird about breastfeeding at all in medieval Europe or Renaissance Europe. There were paintings of the Virgin with child all over churches everywhere. So beyond just the Virgin and child motif, there's also just a lot of other paintings too of normal mothers feeding their children. I came across this beautiful painting of Cézanne's with Hortense breastfeeding Paul. So their son named Paul. This painting is from 1872. And I just find this painting to be so true and honest and beautiful. You have Hortense asleep. She's exhausted. She's taking care of this baby who's probably crying all the time, crying through the night. And she's exhausted, yet she's giving herself to her son. Also, the comfort that you see between the two. The baby, Paul, just sort of holding on to his mother and nursing. And the mother clearly just exhausted. But also, when I see this, I just can't help but appreciate the beauty of the natural intimacy between a mother and child here. Also, in this brief research that I did, I remembered that in 2017, the artist Benjamin Sullivan won the BP Portrait Award with a painting depicting his wife nursing their child. So anyways, I just thought it was really cool to see these collections of art throughout history existing in these sort of databases online, either through Pinterest or Instagram accounts or Tumblr accounts. There's just a lot of interest in this, and for good reason. I don't think breastfeeding should be so stigmatized. Yeah. So let's just talk about the process for a little bit. I gotta say that the flesh tones in this piece were actually pretty difficult. Typically, when I am doing a lot of flesh tones, I like to keep it simple with using a really basic palette of red, yellow, and black paint with white. Typically, I'll use a really saturated red that will allow me to sort of attenuate the colorfulness of the flesh. And then I usually will have a really dull earth yellow on my palette, something like an ochre. And then a black. The black in this palette actually functions as a really desaturated blue for me. And then white. So I'm working with a sort of simple color wheel, you could say. Yellow, red, and blue color wheel, but two of those colors are really dull earth versions of them, the blue and the yellow. And then I allow the red to be the sort of saturated color. And typically I'll pick a red that leans towards orange. And this is a fantastic palette to work with typically because you can mix literally any flesh tone that exists in the world with this palette. All flesh tones, no matter what race you are, exist within this sort of red-orange range. Different levels of saturation and different levels of lightness and darkness, different levels of colorfulness. So I find this is typically a really good starting point. But this painting, why I said it was giving me some difficulties with the flesh tones, it was mostly because the photo that I was working with. The photo was a little underexposed. I took it under natural light with an iPhone, and it was in a dark room. I don't think any lights were on, so there was just a window far off on the other corner illuminating the scene. And it skewed all the hues of the flesh tone towards more of a orange, warm color, kind of radiating throughout the entire painting. And that actually made it necessary for me to pull out a more saturated yellow and a more saturated orange into the palette. So in this, I'm mixing some cad orange and some cad yellow medium or cad yellow light into a lot of these flesh mixtures because the yellow ochre just wasn't achieving the colors that were in the photograph. So like I said, this photo was from back in January. Cecily was only 2.5 months old. Katie was just nonstop exhausted at this point. Staying up all night, nursing Cecily in the middle of the night all the time, nursing her all day long. And, this is, 2.5 months after she had given birth and still trying to recover and her body recover from giving birth. And it's a challenging time. You just feel exhausted nonstop. And that's, my experience as a dad. I'm not the one who was waking up in the middle of the night breastfeeding her. So Katie is just exhausted at this point in January. Yet she's just so willing to give so much of herself to our girls. And this is just so beautiful to me. The physical act of giving oneself to their child, not only just for nourishment, but also for comfort, just for holding your child safely in your arms. And that they feel so comfortable in that place. Because if they were upset or they were mad or hungry, as soon as they're held, there's this kind of magic in nursing that just calms the baby down so much. It's a really beautiful thing to see. I also think it's just such a special thing to witness, this connection between mother and child through nursing and the bond that happens through that experience. So this is totally making me think of something from my experience of being a dad with Agnes. When Agnes was, only like 2-3 months old, she started coming to the studio with me, I would say like 3 or 4 days a week. And she would be there with me for like 12 hours at a time. This is like 2017. She was born in 2016 at the end of the year. And 2017, I moved into a new studio and she would come with me and stay there all day with me while I worked. And when she would get hungry, I was bottle feeding her with Katie's breast milk. So Katie was pumping, and I would bring a bunch of bags of breast milk to the studio. And I gotta say that was one of my favorite times with Agnes. The first year of her life was bottle feeding her. And I think I got a small taste of the kind of connection that you get with a child that maybe a mother might experience with a child when they're nursing. For me, when I would pick Agnes up and start bottle feeding her, she would just instantly calm down and just settle into my arms and into my lap and just let me hold her. And she would just stare up at me with this amazing look that just said, I feel safe right now, and I'm comfortable, and I'm at peace, and I don't want to be anywhere else. She would never squirm or act impatient or upset about what was happening. It's like one of the only moments where a child is just completely serene and at peace. And it's a beautiful thing to experience. And so this year, at the beginning of the year, when Katie was going back to work, I finally was able to start bottle feeding Cecily, I would say in late January, early February. And this is all before COVID really changed our lives. But for about, maybe 5 or 6 weeks, Katie was going back to work, and I would have Cecily for an entire day, and I was bottle feeding her. And I started getting that taste of the same experience that I had with Agnes. But when COVID hit, there was no reason for me to bottle feed her anymore. So I sort of lost the experience that I did have with Agnes that, was probably a good year or so of her life that I was bottle feeding her, maybe even more. And with Cecily, maybe that'll come back. But right now, with everything on lockdown and we're all at home, Katie is breastfeeding Cecily all the time. So I'm starting to actually find that, for me at least, painting from photos is actually really difficult. I trained painting from life and kind of refused to paint from photos for quite a while. And there's definitely a lot of benefits to just painting straight up from life. You get to make the decisions about how much you simplify things. And through the process of translating the reality of the three-dimensional world in front of you into the two-dimensional reality of the canvas, you inevitably get to make all of these sort of curatorial decisions about how you depict things. Do you leave anything out? Do you simplify textures? Do you omit distracting information or distracting objects? With photography, it's really hard to do that, actually. And I'm finding it really difficult to feel that sense of freedom that you get when you're painting from life, and you can make all of those decisions on the fly as the director of the image. So that's something I'm going to keep trying to work on, and something that I'm realizing that I'm not that experienced in. I've painted from life so much that painting from photographs feels like I have a lot to learn, actually. It's funny because usually it's the other way around. Usually painters, especially, I would say this generation of painters, paints from photographs so much that they're more challenged when they have to paint from life, and they almost get terrified with the freedom of painting from life. Whereas I'm terrified of all of the things being decided for me, and I'm having to rebel against the photograph and change things the way I would want to paint them and whatnot. So we'll see how this unfolds as we go forward this week with working from these photographs. So this painting was pretty challenging. There was a lot of elements all coexisting in one little tiny canvas. There's a hand, there's the relationship between the hand and the breast, and Cecily nursing, the central point in the composition where there's all these moments of touch happening. And that was a hard section to work out and to get all of these elements to relate. But I'm actually really happy with the composition. I love this sort of bracketing of the top half and the bottom half being dark. And then you get this nice band of flesh tones flowing through the middle from one side of the composition to the other side of the composition in this nice diagonal. So I'm really happy with how this painting turned out. So that's the painting for today. We've got 2 more paintings this week focusing on iPhone photos of my girls. So I will see you all tomorrow. Take it easy. Bye.